Thank you very much, David. It's a very kind introduction, better than most of the introductions I get, to be honest with you, these days. It's normally a litany of failure, you know. Man who managed to stand against Ken Livingstone twice and lose, a bit like the England football team. Funnily enough, I think it was Enoch Powell, wasn't it, who once said, all great political careers ultimately end in disaster. I think I'm probably sort of living proof that even quite mediocre political careers can end in disaster if you're not careful. There is, of course, life, it has to be said, after politics, and as some of you may know, my business has been traditionally in business turnaround and in management, and so I hope to be able to offer a very, very narrow perspective, if you like, on how the two worlds of politics, local government particularly, and business might learn from each other at a time like this. The speech sort of subtitled for my short section was literally being prepared to challenge, as you see on the screen. And it is worth saying, I don't know whether Norma Baker said this, but in terms of challenge, you know, having lived through as a minister the 90s when we were also cutting back on public spending because it had got out of control and we needed to pull it back. Ken Clarke was Chancellor, of course, very effective at reducing public spending over a period, set in motion a decade or more of quite unparalleled economic progress. But the cuts that we were talking about in those days are nothing like the cuts that you're facing now. I don't suppose anybody in this room, however long you've worked in the industry, has been facing the sort of challenge that is out there in 2011 and, frankly, is going to be there at least until the end of this Parliament. And, you know, if you ever want to remind people just how stark it is, and forgive me, I wasn't able to be here when Norman was talking earlier, but the figures that just still absolutely stagger me are that every single day in this country, we're spending £120 million on debt interest. £120 million on debt interest. Debt interest is now, incidentally, the fourth largest department in government, if you want to put it that way. No, seriously, after work and pensions, which is a couple of hundred million, the NHS, which is over 100, the whole of the education budget, which this year is planned at around 76 billion, that's the whole of the budget. The fourth largest item on the government spending list is debt interest, £42.6 billion. That's bigger than the entire defence budget. It's 5 times what the DFT has to spend. You know, it does sort of underline that the challenge is not an easy one. It's one that we absolutely have to meet. And the basis for this huge cost, well, you know, the world is full of the talk about cuts, but it is just worth remembering that this year we will add another £146.2 billion of public debt to our overall indebtedness. That's down on last year's total of just over £170 billion. But it's still adding. You know, it's a bit like those old inflationary times when we used to say inflation is down because it's only 8% this year, when we forgot that that added to the 10% of last year and the 11% of the year before. You know, we are still actually on the wrong path. And one of the things that I think, you know, from our perspective in local government, central government, that we just have to keep saying to people, and I promise you, this is not a political observation, this is just simply factual, is that by 2015-16, if all the Osborne cuts are effective, and God knows, you know, as Winston Churchill once said, we are all in favour of reductions in general and expenditure in particular, if he gets them all through, public spending in 2015-16 will still be higher than it is today. It will still be higher than it is today, despite all the pain and all the aggravation that that's likely to cause. So, you know, when you talk about challenge, don't anybody think that this is just another government exercise, that this is just somebody in the Treasury waving an arm and, you know, decimating an industry in the way that I hear some people speak. This is desperately serious. And, you know, just to square the political circle, I think we all know that in real terms, had the last government been re-elected, we would have been facing a very similar proposition, because the only way we're able to retain our AAA status in terms of our public debt servicing. In other words, the only reason we can keep the cost of that debt down to 42 billion is because the world believes that we're serious, at least about moderating public spending. Were we not to be, then of course what would happen is that we'd have to pay substantially more for our debt. The Portuguese are finding that out even now as their economy gets downgraded because they wouldn't take the medicine, and the consequence of that of course is you snuff out any prospect of recovery. That's a pretty challenging proposition, it really is. And you know, Andrew McNaughton's talk I saw was entitled, "Why Do We Waste a Good Crisis?" And I have to say, if he hadn't had it, I'd have nicked it. Because I think that's exactly what the challenge is. It's about, you know, facing up to a really quite radical way of doing things and deciding, you know, how we're going to find a way forward. And funnily enough, I'll tell you, in the world of business turnaround, you often are faced with a business that's failing substantially, costs are out of control, sales are hemorrhaging, and you have to act very, very, very quickly because the bank is on your back and the bank wants to see some evidence of change. And I have colleagues in the business who will say, the first thing you ask yourself is, who would the administrator keep? You know, if the administrator does walk in through the door, he or she will take out everyone except those who are absolutely necessary to the management of the business. And we're going to have to be thinking along those sort of lines. It's maybe not as brutal as that, and it's not as, if you like, functional as that, but that really is the challenge, you know, to think quite radically about how we perform service. So if I may, and I say this in due deference to a lot of colleagues here with years more experience at the practical level, here are maybe one or two thoughts as to how we might achieve that. The first, I must say, that we all ought to be examining, that I believe has enormous potential, is effectively cross-boundary cooperation. I know you may have heard a little bit about this already. In London, as you probably know, we have three councils, Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster, who've agreed to look at the proposition around shared services, and incidentally, in so doing, not ceding an inch of political management or control. There is no willingness to do that, there's no desire to do that, and frankly, from our perspective, there's no need to do that. We don't have to make this a political issue. This is about, however, thinking about whether we, in conjunction with our neighbouring local authorities, might be able, first of all, to take out a whole raft of administration cost, and in many cases, that would literally be to take out an element and with the opportunity of reducing it by as much as 60% if we were sharing services across 2 or maybe 3 districts. Secondly, of course, as a result, delivering more negotiating power when you're actually leveraging purchasing and procurement with a bigger budget and with a bigger opportunity to bang the table, then you're actually likely to get better prices and a more acute interest from your supply chain. And thirdly, of course, it allows often, particularly given the vagaries of the political boundaries that we all work to, it actually allows you to optimize services around real boundaries, about the obvious logistic boundaries, which make sense to operators who really don't see the political lines that are drawn on a map. Now, you know, a lot of this is anathema to those of us who've worked. I was in county council before being in Parliament, and then in the DOE, and then in DFT, and all of these are very much concerned with local authority boundaries, local authority, you know, sort of power and control. And I stress again, this is not about weakening the approach that one individual council, even of the same political complexion as its neighbours, might take toward the management of services. But what it is about is a more efficient way of delivering those services in the highways context particularly. Well, what we're recognising is the logistics of better operation, more efficient operation, better management, better procurement, bigger fist on the table, if you like, and the opportunity to take out substantial administrative cost.